Hi, welcome to CityScope. I am your host, Scott Kurland, and with me today is the author of, if you don't mind me, Mark, I'm just going to grab this, of Johnny Appleseed, the Man Behind the Folklore. I am joined with an accomplished author, attorney, and city councilman, Mr. Mark Bodanza. Hi, Mark.
Good afternoon, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So you have written 13 books.
Yes.
And this is a lucky number 13?
This is number 13.
And it comes out in a few weeks, correct?
No, it's out now.
Oh, it's out now?
Oh, yeah, it's out now.
Oh, wonderful. So why don't you talk about your process and how you became an author and everything that led to this book?
Well, at the beginning, it was really quite an accident. Back in 2008, I started to plan a reenactment football game. I was very interested in early football history, and Leominster and Fitchburg have a pretty old rivalry going back to 1894. I thought, boy, would it be a great thing to be able to reenact that first game, not as theater, but as an actual football game. And I approached the trustees of the reservations who managed the property up on Lindell Avenue, the Doyle estate, and asked them if we could do that in that beautiful pasture next to the estate. And I fully expected them to tell me that I was crazy, but they did. They actually liked the idea. So we set about to do that, and it was like planning a wedding. We had to raise money, we had to design clothing, period clothing, build a field, all of the things that went along with putting on a production, really. And I started to write a program that explained the history of the rivalry, decided to explain the history of football, as well as the rules, which were very different back in the late 19th century than they are today, certainly. And that program evolved into a book because there was just too much material, which I thought would sell to my family and friends, and that would be the end of it. But more importantly, it would act as a resource for people interested in the rivalry, interested in early football history. But it turned out it was far more popular than I envisioned, and it sold really well, and still selling. And then I wrote a second book when we reenacted a Leatherhead football game called 1933, Football at the Depth of the Great Depression, which is another testament to football history. I'm very proud to say that Bill Belichick actually read that book and sent me a handwritten note telling me how much he enjoyed it and how well I captured the history of the game. So that was kind of got things kicked off. And then the third book was a biography, a cooperative biography with Boston Celtic legend JoJo White. And that was a pleasure to do. And perhaps one of the greatest testaments of that book is his coach, Tommy Heisman, told me that that book helped get him in the Hall of Fame after waiting 35 years.
Oh, wow.
So that was book 3, and then others followed, and lo and behold, finally got around to writing the story of Johnny Appleseed.
So the story of John Chapman, or Johnny Appleseed, most children learn it in elementary school, and this, I believe, is one of the first actual illustrated books. This is more of, a book for adults.
Yeah, this is adult literature. I mean, it can be read by, a 5th or 6th grader.
Yeah.
But it is primarily geared towards adults. It's a hardcover book. It's obviously it's packed with a lot of information. The book really grew out of the fact that I was doing a book signing at a Barnes & Noble store here in Leominster back a few years ago in December, and the bookstore manager, who I've grown very close to over the years, C.J. Nelson, said to me, "Hey, you should write a book on Johnny Appleseed, because I'm constantly getting customers in here looking for that kind of literature, and we don't have one. We have a book that you wrote called Leominster Chronicles, which is 40 short stories with a lot of historic photographs. There is a chapter in that book on Johnny Appleseed," and she goes, "That's what I sell people, but we don't have a Johnny Appleseed adult literature. There are a slew of children's books on Johnny Appleseed, and there are some adult books on Johnny Appleseed, but they are few and far between."
Right.
Probably one of the best ones ever written was written in 1954 by a guy named Robert Price,
but that book is currently out of print. So I said, why not? So I undertook the project, and I thanked her and promised her I would have my first signing at the Leominster store, because it was her idea, and they've treated me very well over the years.
So with your research, how long did it take you to basically form what became this book?
I had some basic understanding of who Johnny was and the genealogy, and some quirks about some interesting things, like the fact that one of his, I think the paternal side of his family, came to here from England on a boat called the Planter.
Okay.
And his maternal side, one of the estates, his great-grandfather left an estate that had 10 good fruit-bearing trees in the estate. So there were some quirky things I had already known, and some research I had done. But, you know, I thought I knew a fair amount about John Chapman, but when I dug into this a little bit more deeply, I realized I didn't really know as much as I thought I knew. It was really surprising how much information there is out there on him, and how different and varied it is. And he's a very enigmatic kind of individual, very quirky, very eccentric type of person. But even in that, he wasn't always viewed by his community the way eccentrics are.
Yeah.
He engendered a certain amount of respect, despite how strange his sort of manner of dress and ways of doing things were.
Because usually when he is depicted, it's either, you know, a childlike innocence or, you know, a traveling mountain man.
Yeah.
So in your research, are both correct?
He's probably someplace in between. He was a vegetarian. Mm-hmm. He did not believe in harming animals or plants. In fact, you know, all of his trees were grown from seeds. And that's not how you usually grow apple trees. As far back as 3000 BC, the Chinese developed grafting. Most apple trees today, and even in the 18th and 19th centuries in America, were grown through a grafting process.
Oh, wow.
And there's a very interesting reason that is. That's something I never knew until I did this research, is that an apple seed is literally like a little computer chip. It contains the ability to grow sometimes as many as 100 different varieties of apples from that seed. So when you plant the seed, you don't know what you're going to get. And that's not acceptable to most orchardists. So what they do is they take a generic rootstock and they graft a known variety of tree into that rootstock, so they know what they're developing for an apple. Johnny didn't do that for a couple of reasons. One, he was very religious and he thought that was messing with God. Mm-hmm. And the other reason he didn't do it is he didn't want to hurt the tree by cutting it. Now, this, of course, produced, in many cases, seedlings that were growing what some people might view as substandard apples. But that wasn't a problem back in those days on the pioneering, you know, frontier, because apples were not consumed like we consume apples today. Today, you know, a lot of apple consumption, of course, we bake pies and make apple butter and things like that. Yeah. Apple crisp, famously at our fair
Yes.
in a couple weeks. But most people didn't sit down to eat an apple. What they used apples for on the frontier was to make cider,
Yep.
hard cider in many cases,
Yes.
to make vinegar, two very useful products on the frontier, to make things like apple butter and pies. But, you know, sitting down to eat apples, not so much.
Weren't regular apples normally eaten by livestock, like horses?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, so the variety of the apple that was getting grown from these seedlings wasn't as critical then as it is today. And don't forget, Johnny Appleseed traveled on foot or by, you know, a canoe, usually a dugout log,
Yeah.
you know, watercraft. And he couldn't carry rootstock and branches and all those implements with him. So he was traveling light, and obviously the seeds were much lighter than traveling with grafting material. So there was a lot of reasons for that.
Was there any truth to, he's always depicted as either being barefoot or wearing really big boots. Was he actually barefoot when he went on his journeys?
I had some doubts about that myself based on the ruggedness of the terrain and the temperatures and all that. But it turns out that oftentimes he was barefoot.
Oh, well, even in the snow?
Yes, and he had very thick calluses on his feet. And his feet must have been nasty, to say the least. And his clothing was oftentimes recycled, old clothes that nobody else would wear, coffee sacks that he would cut a hole out for his head and arms. They called, sometimes he wore multiple pairs of pants that were worn out below around his waist that almost created a kilt-like covering of his body. I mean, he was the ultimate minimalist. He did not believe in wasting anything or any extravagance when it came to his personal adornment or, his lifestyle.
Now, how did you personally write this book? We were talking beforehand. You mentioned that you started writing this in 2020.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like everything in society, COVID had an impact. So I finished a manuscript about a very different subject, a hijacking of a TWA plane back in 1985. Largely that book was born out of the fact that I knew one of the hostages that was on the plane. And I asked him if he ever thought about doing his story. And fortunately, he had kept a journal from 1985, and I interviewed him several times, and we wrote a very compelling, fascinating story about that hijacking and hostage taking, because it lasted over 2 weeks, the entire process. Fortunately, most were freed. One Navy diver was murdered in this whole process, Robert Steedham, which was obviously very tragic.
Yeah.
But it was an amazing story, and I finished that manuscript, and COVID was prohibiting at that point, any real gatherings. So I didn't feel like I wanted to market it without the ability to do book presentations, book signings. So I held it back. And I like meeting with people, meeting with crowds, talking about my books. And like I said, couldn't do it during COVID. So what I did is essentially, hold it out for a while. And instead of stopping writing, I kept writing. Mm-hmm. So then I wrote another manuscript, which was the Johnny Appleseed transcript. And then I went back and published the other book, which was called Hostage Terror. And this sat in inventory, this manuscript sat in inventory. And I've likewise written, while I was waiting to get this published, written another manuscript, which is in inventory now, on Benjamin Franklin and Walt Disney.
You've been very busy.
Yeah, I tend to keep busy.
So,
excuse me.
So in the book, you talk about the Johnny Appleseed stamp.
Yes.
And it was pretty much a contest, or?
The stamp intrigued me because I was a youngster when it came out.
Yeah.
It was issued in 1966 as part of a 6-stamp American Folklore series, and it was the first of the stamps to be issued. When a stamp gets issued, they select an appropriate community to host the first day of issue, and stamp collectors will collect what's called a first day cover, which is essentially the envelope with what's called a cachet, which is a design or engraving on the left side of the envelope. On the right side of the envelope, a stamp will be affixed where it normally is, and then that stamp will be canceled, and it will have the date of cancellation as well as the words first day of issue, meaning that's the first day that stamp was put into official use. So with the Johnny Appleseed American Folklore series stamp that came out in 1966, there was, unbeknownst to me at the time, a contest amongst communities as to who would host that. And there were arguments made for Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is where he's buried. Mm-hmm. Probably other places too, but certainly Mansfield, Ohio, where he spent a good deal of time, and other communities in Ohio where he had a big impact on the frontier. But we had a pretty powerful congressman here, I guess, in this district. And through the work of a couple of Leominster Historical Society gentlemen, Mr. Forrest and Mr. Green. They prevailed upon Senator Phil Philbin to work on that, and they were successful in getting Leominster to be the site of the first day issue.
So you mentioned you were at Northwest.
I was.
Elementary.
Yeah.
So did they announce it to your school that...
We had a curriculum back in those days, many years ago, where there was local history, was a fourth grade portion of the curriculum, and I was intrigued by it. I was intrigued by stamps. I was intrigued because of the history that is depicted by stamps, and so it was all sort of a natural amalgamation of things. Johnny Appleseed because he's a local person, stamps generally, and local history. So it was an impression on me back then, and I never kind of forgot it. And I actually start the book in the introduction off with a story about how Leominster celebrated Johnny Appleseed, not just then, but also in 1974, which was the 200th anniversary of his birth. He was born on September 26th, 1774.
Oh, wow. I think we have some stills that you provided us with.
Yeah.
If my crew in the booth could bring those up, and we can look at...
That's the official program from the first day of issue ceremony back in 1966, demonstrating the stamp on an actual stamp with a cancellation. So if you were lucky enough to attend that, you got that as a handout, and you got not only the poster, the little poster, it was 8.5 by 11, plus the stamp itself with the appropriate cancellation.
Wow. Let's move on to the next one. So
that
this
is an
the
actual
postcard.
first day issue cover. You can see, as I said, the cachet design on the left and the stamp itself with the first day cancellation on it.
All right. Next one, please.
This is Johnny Appleseed Lane, which was part of Nashua Street back in 1974, and the city renamed it as part of a bicentennial celebration for Johnny Appleseed's 200th anniversary of his birth. And that marker, that's a photograph I took of the marker that is at his home site where he was born, down on Johnny Appleseed Lane.
I think we have one more.
A little cooler back then, of course.
Yeah.
That's coming again. Now that it's September 1 already.
Yeah. So, Mark, in the research, did you go visit most of these places?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Yeah. There's other local stuff around here too that has a connection to him. I discovered his mom died when he was 2. And nobody really knows where she's buried.
Yeah.
Probably in Pine Grove Cemetery, but probably most definitely in an unmarked grave if she's there. So nobody really knows quite with any certainty where she's buried. After his mom died, his father was in the Revolutionary War. He was in the Continental Army.
We have the last one.
We do. Okay, let's bring that up. There we go.
The book cover, of course.
I had to surprise you, yes.
Illustrated by my dear friend Stephen Ledger, who is an immense talent. And his illustrations also appear throughout the book. That illustration comes from a mural that's about 6 feet long and about 4 feet high. And pieces of that mural are, like I said, distributed throughout the book. Stephen's drawings are so detailed, and there's so much stuff in that. That's the aged Johnny Appleseed being cradled by Mother Nature, and if one looks carefully, just above his head in the knot of that tree is Mother Nature, the face of Mother Nature.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, going back to what you were saying in the research, so what did you learn about Johnny's mother?
So after she died, I believe he went to live with his maternal grandparents, who were the Simons family. And his maternal grandparents lived on Maple Avenue in Leominster, near what became the number 2 schoolhouse. And the funny part about it is I drive by there every day on my commute to work, and I didn't realize till I got into the research that most likely he lived 4 years on a road that I drive by every single day. His father got remarried when he left the military. He married an 18-year-old woman. He was 34, and had a lot of children with her. I think more than 10, and sent for young Johnny and his sister, who were here back in Leominster, and they went out to Longmeadow to live in a home that was about 700 square feet, which still exists. And one could imagine after living there for a few years, in a rented piece of property without any real chance of economic success at that point, that young John Chapman and his half-brother Nathaniel decided to strike out on their own, if you will.
So the book, for everyone watching, is Johnny Appleseed, the man behind the folklore. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
And do you have anything that you want to promote of, any events you'll be going to promote this?
Sure. I will be at the Barnes & Noble store in Leominster on Saturday, September 9th, from noon to 4. And I will be talking about the book. Barnes & Noble Company is now doing something with their authors where they want the author to present some information at these book signings, which I'm more than happy to do because I like doing that. So that's coming up on September 9th. And I, of course, will be signing the books. And at the Johnny Appleseed Fair, our 30th anniversary of the fair, on September 23rd, I believe it is, I will be there all day talking about Johnny Appleseed and signing my books. Stay tuned. There'll be other local signings and beyond. I have a website where all my books are located, markbodanza.com, very simple. Anybody has any questions, I'm very active on Facebook. They want to reach me there, they can send me a message, whatever they want to do. I love talking about this stuff. I'm going out to Gardner to speak at the Gardner Museum on September 21st at 7 o'clock about local abolitionist Francis Drake. So I'll be at the number 6 schoolhouse, third Tuesday in October. It's a Tuesday, 7 o'clock at night. I'm there every year. I do some presentation on local history. Great place if you've never been in that before, at the corner of Union and Pleasant Streets. So thanks for having me, Scott. It's always a pleasure to come to LTV and use this wonderful community access we have. And I look forward to doing some more episodes of Nation Rising with you.
Yes, I look forward to that too. And thank you everyone for tuning in. If you have something that you want to promote or come on to CityScope for a topic that's important to you, you can email me at ltv@leominster.tv. Until next time, I'm Scott Kurland, and thank you for tuning in.